right, previously we talked about add and subtract, which was just combining like terms. Multiplication is a little bit different. You still combine like terms, but that's at the end. So first you're either distributing rainbow or you're doing FOIL, which is still distributive property, but that's that box method that we did previously in the beginning of chapter 7. Anytime I see an I squared, so when I multiply an I times an I, like in this one, I'm going to get an I squared. The rule with this is you never leave an I squared, you always replace it with a -1. So what happens is an I squared is like forbidden, and you replace it with a -1 so that it's going to combine with a constant. So if we look at this first example, I've got a couple different I things going on here. I know I was just pointing to this part, but there is a beginning to it. So first I'm going to multiply 2 times 3i, which is 6i. Now it says -5i, so I'm going to use this negative to distribute through. So a negative times a negative is positive. 5 times 8, which is 40. And then the I is attached to it. It's just like, again, put an X on it, put an A on it, put a P on it, whatever. Now I'm going to continue to distribute -5i to the +5i. So a negative times a positive is negative. 5 times 5 is 25. And then I times I is I squared. Right here is my I squared. So first off, I can combine these two because they're my I terms. And I get 46i. But now I have to replace this I squared with a -1. So if you can do this in your head, that's totally fine. I'm just going to put it in here. -25 times a -1 is what it says. Because -25i squared says -25 times I squared. So if I continue to simplify this part, because I've got to fix that or finish the multiplication, I get 46i. Negative times a negative is positive, 25. So now my new complex number has a constant of 25. In this first part of it, there is no constant, and if it's a true complex number, there usually is a constant. The constant could be 0. If you notice with this one here, 3i doesn't have a constant with it. 5i didn't have a constant with it. And like I said, usually they do. So FOIL, or distributive property, I've got -3 plus 8i times 2 plus 2i. I'm not going to use the box because it's too hard to draw, but it's -3. That's going to multiply to 2 plus 2i. And I'm going to have 8i. That's going to multiply to the 2 plus 2i. Remember when we did this in the beginning of the chapter in order to FOIL. And then I add my solutions together. It has nothing to do with this. It was just how you combine your like terms. You're always going to add them. So now I'm going to distribute -3 times 2, -3 times 2i, plus 8i times 2, which is 16i, and 8i times 2i, which is positive 16i squared. Now I'm going to look to see how I can simplify this. Right here in the middle, because I did FOIL, there's always those two that combine. If you remember in the box method, these two terms on the diagonal are almost always something you can combine. You have this special number and this special number. So that's what we've got. We've got a -6. I've got these two middle terms that add, which is 10i. And then I've got the 16i squared. So remember, anytime I see an I squared, I'm going to replace it with a -1. So now I have -6 and a -16 and a 10i. This one and this one, as I said before, become a new constant. So I'm going to add these two together. They're both negatives, so it's -22 plus 10i. That's my simplified solution. If I have a special product, like a perfect square, it also works. So we're going to get into all kinds of perfect square review again before we start factoring. If you remember how I taught you to do this, this squared distributes to each term. So square 5 is 25. Square of 4i is 16i squared. Notice how I put those together first, because that, when I replace it, there's my constant. And then I multiply by putting a plus sign down. 2 times 4, which is 8, times 5, which is 40i. I multiply everything there is. That's the shortcut version of it. So going back to simplifying this, 25 plus negative 16, I'm not going to rewrite the negative 16 times, or 16 times negative 1, that's where that came from. I squared becomes a negative 1, plus 40i. 25 minus 16 is 9, plus 40i. And there you have multiplication. The next part that we're going to look at is division, which involves a little bit more work, but it's not overly terrible.